Awesome, Steve. Really nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me on the Mark Divine Show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, likewise, likewise. We have a lot in common. I'm super stoked to get your take on how hard things develop resilience and mental toughness and all that. But tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and I know you're in Houston now, but where you're from, and what were some of the early influences in your life?
Yeah, so I actually grew up not too far from where I live in the suburbs. Although I
Okay.
ventured off, I ended up, coming back. But, I think early on, my influence was all in sport and athletics.
Okay. Hmm.
Is I loved all sorts of sports. I grew up kind of diehard baseball, soccer, football, whatever, following them, playing them. And for the longest time, I thought I was going to be like, really good at soccer, and I was pretty good.
Hmm.
But once I reached and got to high school, I realized that I was really good for the sole reason that I was faster than everybody and could outlast everybody. It wasn't my
Okay.
skills.
Yeah, yeah. I
And
was kind of like that too. Like I had incredible fitness, but when it came to the actual skill, yeah,
exactly.
I was a little off. You need a lot of practice.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
it's interesting because you want to master the skill, but
right.
if the fitness is your forte, it's just a little different. And
Interesting.
I was fortunate early on to have a high school coach who, got me to come out for cross country and track for some reason, and I
Mhm,
was really resistant and didn't really like the idea of just running around in circles. But he convinced me that like this is where my talent lied,
mhm,
and convinced me that hey, like you could be okay at soccer, but you could be really good at running. And his influence really kind of changed the director or the trajectory of my kind of life at that moment, where I joined the cross country and track team, and then took off. And by the end of my senior year, I was a 401 miler and
mm.
the fastest high schooler in the country.
That's pretty fast. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty fast. So, which isn't I had no idea what that was or what that meant, when I
yeah.
started, but, like, once you get into
Let's talk
s
about that for just a second. What does it take? Because I know that of course, breaking the 4 minute mile is like a big psychological barrier, and now many people have done it. I mean, I don't. You probably know how many people have done it, but what does it take to go from a 4:01 to like a 3:58 or whatever the fastest runners are running, or three whatever? What is it, by the way? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So the world record now is, 3:43.
3:43.
So
Okay,
which is crazy.
that is
So,
crazy.
I'll give you the long story short is, so my I ended up running 4:01 in high school and then never broke that barrier, even though I
Okay.
tried for years. So,
Hmm.
maybe I'm not the best person to ask, but I have coached people to run faster, and I think here's what it is that there's such a kind of mystique around that 4-minute barrier, even now, decades
Hmm.
later.
Hmm.
Um, but there's such a mystique that it gets kinda stuck in your head.
I bet.
And there's a symmetry about it because it's simple. You run 4 laps around the track, you run them in a minute or less, and you get the gold. And where I often would struggle is there's not really much fitness difference between a 401 and a 359.
Right.
But when you're coming around and you're seeing, less than 1 minute, less than 2 minutes, less than 3 minutes as you get through laps, is that tension kinda rises.
Hmm.
And instead of relaxing into that moment and being like, I'm on pace, I'm on track, just keep this thing going. What often throws people off is that tension rises. You feel that, oh, I have a
Hmm.
shot, I have a shot. And you end up almost self sabotaging yourself
Right.
because you get tight, you use more energy, and then you just kind of crater over that last little bit
Hmm.
and fall just short.
Did you use visualization back then to run your race as a part of your practice?
Absolutely. This was a big part of actually, I'd call it my breakthrough.
Right.
So, when I was a junior in high school, I was a pretty good runner, but I'd only run like 4:17. So, to put that in context, that's like, maybe the top 100 or so in the nation.
Yeah.
So, to go from that to the first is a big jump.
Hmm.
But what allowed me to do that is that entire summer and season before I kind of made that jump is almost every run, every workout, I'm just visualizing in my head,
Mhm.
Like, what is it like to run this 4-minute mile? What it
Mhm.
is it like to run significantly faster than I've ever been before? So when it came down to race day, I'd been in that spot.
Mhm.
I'd gone through in my head kind of what it was gonna take, what it was gonna feel like, when the pain and discomfort was gonna rise, and how
Mhm.
I was gonna handle that.
Mhm.
And it kind of allows you to kinda navigate that in a much better manner.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that. I've had some powerful experience with the visualization, and I think ultimately, um, given the right conditions, enough time, everything is first created in the mind. Like everything that happens in the world is first created in the mind. Problem is, there are some other structural and external conditions that need to line up to support the particular goals that we select, right? So, like, your body type might have been just like 1 inch off from the optimal body type to be able to be a world record holder, but you had the body type good enough, right? And then with your visualization skills and etc.
I
For me, I was a competitive swimmer and a competitive rower, and I used visualization for my swimming and had pretty extraordinary experiences with that. But I didn't do it with my rowing, and I rowed only for a year and a half. But I was so fit. I was considered the fittest guy at my university. I mean, to where like article was written about me, and people were just kind of knew it, right? I ran a triathlon on a whim one day and just destroyed everybody in it. And I'd never run a triathlon before, and so, my coach said, "You're really good rower," and I was, a stroke for the 8-man team, heavyweight 8. Said, "I want you to test for the Olympic, team," and this was down at Cornell at the race camp, and so I went down there and I just completely bombed it. And it was because this what you just described. I got into the erg, and it was one of these it was a new, wooden kind of flywheel erg, and God, it was different than the Concept 2s we were using, and then we got in the boat, and I'd never done kind of one of these fake boats, where
Mhm.
you weren't actually rowing, and I was all nervous, and I seized up, and I kinda bombed it. I didn't even get a second chance,
Mm.
even though I was probably one of the fittest guys in the country rowing crew at the time. I just did not have the time, the dirt time or the water time, And also, I'm 6'1", but the guys at the Olympics rowing are like 6'4", 6'5", And so I
I
think that structurally, I just wasn't the right body type either. So the goal was not the right goal for me.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the most important points is that, like, when you get to the upper echelon of performance, whether that's in sport or whatever you do, is often those small things that you
Yeah,
can't control for
right.
end up
That's right.
being difference makers, right?
That's right. And
So
you can overcome a lot of that
yeah.
with time and practice, but then there's just a point where everything kind of has to line up to be the best at something.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's why to me, and I'm sure you think similar, is like to me, perfecting whether that's through practice or the mental skills is about, well, let's see how close to my limit I can
That's right.
get.
That's right.
And if I can do things like that visualization or like spend time practicing or spend time, preparing in a specific way, then that's going to allow me to get closer to my limit. And no one knows where that is unless you go explore it.
That's right. And I think that the message is so important for athletes and those physical strivers like us is like it's not healthy to think that your only end result is to be number one or to get that world record or be on the Olympic podium. It really isn't healthy because very few people do it. And I'm not saying, those who are qualified and fit and have the skills and great coaching shouldn't go for that, right? Because if the stars are lining up that whether you got a chance. But if you define yourself by that, that's not healthy, right? So define yourself by being the best that you can be within, the construct of all the limitations and opportunities that you have
Yeah,
and be okay with that, be satisfied with that.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's actually, worked with a lot of high level elite athletes in a variety of sports, and that's often something that they have to like come to terms with
Right.
and often struggle with because, like, if you solely define yourself by the results on on the field or the track or whatever it is, well, you can get away with that kind of early in your career and as you're developing, but at some point you're gonna most likely, unless you happen to have those stars align where you are the best in the world, most likely you're going to come up to a point of failure or a
That's right.
point where you realize like if everything's aligned and everything's clicking, maybe I'm 10th best in the world. And that's
That's
fantastic.
pretty cool. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but if you're solely like defined by like it's gold medal or bust, like that can put you in a really bad spot.
Hmm.
And that's where I think a lot of times elite athletes, often you see this after the Olympics, is they struggle with that.
Yeah, they have like post-Olympic depression, like postpartum depression. Well, here's
Exactly.
the other kind of uncanny side effect of non-attachment to the outcome is that you relax more. You know,
Mhm.
like you could literally get that podium moment because you don't care about getting that podium moment
E
because
ex
you're relaxed.
Exactly, and I think that's that's one of the hard things. It's really, in sport, I think we do a very poor job of is we often tell people like keep pushing, 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 which it makes sense. Like we want to, be able to push through adversity, but that pushing often has to come from like a relaxed space
That's right.
where
Well,
if you
the
take
flow you never get into flow state if you're all tensed up or you're, freaking out about, whether the person next to you. Remember when I swam 200 breaststroke, it's just kind of like running. If you're neck and neck with someone, you can both see and feel their presence, right? And it kind of freaks you out. And so you get a little seized up, right? And you try to swim faster, which actually slows you down. You're not relaxing and you're not, slow is smooth, smooth is fast kind of thing. You don't do
Bing
that.
bingo. That's it. That's
Yeah.
why I always love to point people to, like Usain Bolt in the 100. I loved
Yeah.
watching him because here's the guy who's about to run, I don't know, 27, 28 miles per hour, just crazy fast.
Right.
But you watch him on the starting line and then when he's racing, and he is so relaxed while doing it, even
Right.
though he's putting massive amounts of force into the ground.
Mhm.
And I guarantee you can feel the tension of someone like on his
Mhm.
shoulder,
Mhm.
but he's able to like relax and let his body do the work instead of like tensing up and fighting himself.
How do you coach people to do that? That's a master skill.
It is, and it's a lot similar to I'd imagine what you kind of went through in your career, which is the stress, anxiety, pressure causes you to kind of narrow and tense,
Mhm.
and you have to spend time in that crucible
Mhm.
where
Right.
you're teaching your body to essentially do the opposite, relax into it. And you're
Right.
teaching your body, often is teaching your body that, hey, you don't need to sound the alarm, right? You don't
Mhm.
need to put me in this freak out, this hyper stress mode. I am okay in this space.
Right.
So it's kind of the same as like keeping your head on straight or steady when you're I don't know what I would imagine or what I've talked to other military professionals is when you get stuck in a sticky situation and in the field is it's really keeping your mind calm enough where you can
Mhm.
see clearly. It's the
Mhm.
same in athletic performance is you need to spend a lot enough time doing the difficult thing but not trying to tense up fight it but learning how to stay smooth calm and relaxed while doing it.
Yeah, totally. And for us, it's like reality-based training where the training is as intense as what you're gonna experience in combat, as intense as you can without, obviously the danger of someone actually trying to shoot you in the head. Because that probably wouldn't go over so well with the government,
Yeah, and
It's
and
so
it's a simple concept, but
yeah,
in psychology, they just call it stress inoculation,
that's right. Yeah.
right? You experience more of that stress and this is where I think it's really important is in an environment that simulates what you're going to face.
Yeah.
Is it's something that puts you in that similar situation so that you can kind of train your body to turn that alarm down.
Right.
And there's a lot another thing that I think is important that is sometimes missed here is you've gotta teach people the skills to be able to do this. You
Mhm.
can't just, throw them into the difficult situation and hope they survive because
Mhm.
that's a little bit like taking someone who's unfit and being like, "Go lift some heavy weights or run an all-out
Mhm.
mile." Well, they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Their mind's just gonna freak out because they maybe haven't experienced that discomfort and for some years or decades.
That's right. Yeah, there's a whole host of crawl, walk, run, body, mind, and emotional skills that are layered on over the years. Do you think that virtual reality can do that, do you think we'll be able to like throw people into a virtual environment and accelerate their learning or shorten the time to that kind of greatness moment?
I think that there will be some good applications for this, and
Hmm.
I've actually talked to some sports teams dabbling in this area because
Hmm.
it can create, as the technology gets better, it can create a more realistic view of it.
Right.
A
Immersive. Yeah.
immersive, and as I'm sure you're aware, even with things like visualization, the data is pretty clear where it says, like, the more you can make it feel real,
Right.
where you see the
Hmm.
environment you're in and almost, like, smell and experience it and
Hmm.
utilize all those senses, the more your brain kinda latches onto it and says, "Oh, okay. Like, we actually are training this."
Right.
And I think that's going to be a helpful spot because it literally can become brain training. And I think with some of the technology actually to look at kind of brain waves and stuff like that, we're going to be able to almost take that to nth degree where we can see, is your kind of fear center going through the roof? How do
Right.
we turn that down and get you
Hmm.
to get back in control in this,
Yeah, you
simulated
can
situation?
personalize the virtual reality simulation so that each operator in the military setting or each athlete is getting customized input based
Exactly.
on needs.
Because the way I kind of like to think of it is like stress can send us a number of different ways. Like some of
Hmm.
us get super narrow, right?
Hmm.
And we don't see anything in the periphery. Others of us kind of get dissociated and it's almost like we're in that fog where everything is a little chaotic. And again, I think the research is in its infancy, but if you can tailor like how to deal with that stress and get them back in that kind of flow, that zone,
Hmm.
then you're going to be in a better spot. So I think there's a lot of cool applications that are maybe not too far down the pipeline.
Yeah. Okay. So you did this high school with college running and athletics, and then how did you get into what you do now? Um,
Yeah,
what was the path like for you?
absolutely. So, I was an athlete who was all I cared about was sport. All I
Hmm.
cared about was running. So I went to school, graduated from college because like that kept me eligible to keep running.
Right.
So that was kind of my
It's
mindset.
a
So
good plan.
once I got done though, I was like, okay, well, what I do? My running, I got to a pretty high level, but not a high enough to keep doing this.
There's not a
So
whole lot of people paying people to just run around the
E
track.
exactly. It's a
Right.
very, very small number of people, so it's not a very lucrative career except for a handful of people in the world.
Right.
So, reality kinda smacks you in the face, and what ended up happening is I got into, doing the thing that I knew how to do at that moment, which was just helping coach people to perform better.
Hmm.
And at first, for the first several years of my career, that was in track and field.
Hmm.
And then since then, it's kind of taken off into the world of, well, performance is performance, which is like the same kind of inner battle or struggle with anxiety or doing difficult things that a track athlete might go through is the same struggle that any athlete will go through or an executive who's
Hmm.
trying to figure out how to make difficult decisions in high pressure situations. It's the same kind of psychology and mental side of it.
Hmm.
So in the last couple of years, I've really expanded off of that and kind of taken a broader view of performance.
Hmm. I'm curious, how have you bridged either, the game or the process of coaching an athlete to coaching a CEO? Right. So I
Yeah,
agree with you. Some of the principles are the same, but the context is completely different.
context is completely different. And what I would say there is I'm all about the basics and the foundation.
Hmm.
So what you see or what I've seen is that athletes are often pretty good about the foundation
Hmm.
because it's they have to develop the skills of their sport.
Hmm.
And executives, what you see is often they don't have that foundation. And what I mean by that is
They
the
don't have the
base
health and the physical structure and the
it,
practice and the discipline. Yeah, that an
exactly.
athlete has.
Those
Interesting.
things are lacking. So
Right.
it's often people think, "Oh, it must be like the final couple percent that you
Yeah.
focus on." And it's no, it's creating that structure and that discipline, the physical practice, the health, the sleep,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
well-being
Hmm.
so that they can actually have the freedom to perform because right now they're performing at I don't know, 60% capacity because they're kind of getting in their own way.
I think that's awesome because we used to say in the SEALs, you got to always come back to the basics because even though we had a solid foundation, The other part of that is if you only work on the most advanced techniques, tactics, procedures, whatever, then the basics get rusty,
Mhm.
which then kind of puts some kinks into the foundation. So you've got to, you always came back, and every time we did a training package, whether it's shooting, diving, jumping, whatever, we would always come back and start at the beginning. Now we would go through it a lot faster and move up beyond it quickly compared to, when we just got out of buds or whatever. We found that repetition of the basics was profoundly valuable because it allowed us to operate at an optimal level of performance and then peak for whatever particular op that we needed to go on, or special skill that we needed to like pull off, pull out of our kit bag, and like, okay, now we're going to polish this off, but we didn't have to go back to the basics at that point, right?
Exactly. I love that. I've found something similar in sport, especially, but it's the best of the best never get bored of the basics
Right.
because they know, just like you said, you have to retool them or you have to like return to them. And that's why, I've been fortunate to, watch and observe and work with, some team sport athletes in professional sport. And, I remember watching some NBA guys where I'm like, seeing drills that they're doing to maybe just start their practice that are the same drills that
That's right.
some high school kid who's
Right.
just learning how to shoot and play are doing. And, they don't spend a lot of time on it, but they return to it enough where it's like, okay, here's the foundation. Remember what it's like before I move to the
Right. Right.
advanced stuff.
I love this. Reminded of martial arts or martial kind of warrior quote or concept from Miyamadi Masashi, author of the Book of Five Rings, famous Japanese swordsman, and he said it's better to do one sword cut 100,000 times than 100,000 sword cuts once each. And so what's happening, I think, is it's important to practice those fancy things that get you to from 98% to 100% efficiency, but when it comes to doing the basics, what you're doing is you're training your mind through that repetition to be able to let go of all the processing power that you would normally give to that, so that you have all that power, all the mental focus and acuity for that 2% refinement, right? And so you're able to operate at a much higher level because those fundamentals are just so drilled in that they're just happening spontaneously. There's like zero mental or neurocognitive power going to them, right?
You're spot on. It frees you up to do the things that kind of matter in those moments. And I think I think this is one of the things where I think modern society kind of backfires is
Right.
that the basic things don't look great on Instagram or TikTok or
Yeah, they're
whatever
not
people
very
post
shiny
on.
and fancy or sexy, right? It's like, yeah,
Exactly. It's kind of like the boring stuff consistently over the long haul gets you, as you said, 98% of the way, but it's boring and it's
yeah,
it's it's not the fancy shiny stuff. So what happens is a lot of people don't spend enough time doing them, so they never reach their kind of performance ceiling because they didn't ever establish that foundation, and they instead tried to skip steps and jump to the
right,
final 2% where it doesn't have as big of impact unless you've got
right.
that big foundation.
The other benefit is there's it affects the emotional development of the athlete or the warrior. In my example, great. Another example of that is like in Karate Kid, right? So the kid goes to Miyagi-san and wants to get right into doing, roundhouse kicks and whatever fancy stuff. And Miyagi says, "Okay, well, no, we're not even actually going to start training karate. You just go paint this fence or wax this fence. Wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off." And so what he's doing is forging his character and developing humility and actually preparing his emotional control so that he's ready to do the actual training, the technique training. I think that that's basically what buds is, or special ops pipeline training. That's wax on, wax off. People think, oh yeah, you learned to be a Navy SEAL in buds. I'm like, no, I didn't. That was pure humility training and how to be a good teammate and making sure I wasn't going to kill myself and anybody else. And then I started to learn some fundamental skills, when I got to the SEAL team.
I'm so glad you said that because in writing and researching the book, I talked to a couple of former Navy SEALs and they kind of echoed the same thing, which is
So
people see buds and they get all excited and rightfully so. I mean, from everything I've heard from others, it's like a very hard, obviously time, but it teaches that kind of, as you said, that teamwork, et cetera, but it's really that stuff afterwards that teaches you that kind of foundation of how to be a SEAL. And I think in the broader society, we kind of turn to the shiny object, which, is buds, and be like, how do we mimic all that? And we forget the rest of it.
That's right. That's really cool. So your book is called "Do Hard Things." What is like if you were to describe like your model? This is my 5-point model. For developing mental toughness, and we of course do hard things as part of that. What does that look like? And let's talk about some of the more interesting things that you found.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. If we just say my model is number one, I think is seeing things clearly or embracing reality,
Hmm.
which I think is often what happens is we think of, oh, I need to be tough, so I got to put on this like external face and this external bravado. And what it really is no, you need to develop the inner confidence and the ability to see the task at hand very clearly
Hmm.
for what it is, and
Hmm.
also see what your tools and capability is and
Hmm.
are clearly as well. And that's foundational to it.
Hmm.
And I think, okay, so that's model, we'll say pillar number one of the
Right.
model.
I like
The
that.
other things that I think are really quick are really important going through really quickly is that second pillar to me is like understanding your inner world,
Hmm.
which, as we talked about, emotional control, understanding the feelings, emotions, the inner dialogue, the self-talk that comes with doing challenging things is central to everything.
That's right.
Is we can't just push it away and ignore it and say, "You know what? I'm gonna ignore these doubts or this emotion." You've gotta learn what it means and how to navigate it instead of just kinda shoving it off to the
Yeah.
side.
And sports athletics, endurance. It's such a great way to come face to face with those patterns that are shaping our behavior anyways, right? So if it comes out when you do hard things or you fail on the court or in the track, that's great because now you can take a look at it there, right? As opposed to it showing up, in the boardroom later and destroying a business or a marriage, right? Or something like that. So that
Exactly.
inner terrain that you're talking about really is the patterns and the what the yogis would call the samskaras, the things that are kind of like shaped how our mind has been trained by our family of origin and epigenetically and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. I think if we see our inner world as something that can be trained and
Hmm.
developed, all that stuff, it puts us off in a better spot. And I think often what happens is people make the mistake in saying, oh, like you're either tough and you got it figured out or you're not. Well, the
Yeah,
reality is that's not the case,
that's right.
is that we can all kind of develop this inner strength or this ability to navigate our inner world. It just takes repetition and putting ourselves in those situations where we have to navigate it, and sometimes that means failing and losing, which can teach us again valuable skills for, okay, how do we handle this in a better way.
Right.
And I think so often what happens is in our modern world, we often think of losing or failure as something that we should avoid,
Hmm.
and that is like a testament that we ourselves are a loser or failure,
Hmm. Right.
instead of seeing it as this is part of the journey, this is part of the process. It's gonna happen, and as you said there, it's often better to learn that lesson on how to navigate, bounce back, deal with it
Hmm.
early on through maybe sport or school or what have you, so that when you face something that actually matters,
Yeah.
and matters a lot, you have those skills to be able to process it and handle it in a better way.
Right. And you just alluded to one of those master skills is to learn that there's no such thing as failure. There's only learning and growth. You know,
Exactly.
I've one of the things I loved about athletics and then martial slash military training is that you learn that training is paramount, right, for your quality of life, and that if you're not training, because every one of us have experienced periods of non-training, either through injury or, like you say, one of those like super peak moments, like, hey, I just won the gold medal, and then you just stop everything because you're burnt out and you don't have a goal, and then you go into this period of like, geez, all these patterns are coming up, and you start to get shaped by other people and external events, and you're like, wow. So where I'm going with this is this is a saying I say often to my tribe is if you're not training yourself, then someone else is training you and the results will speak for themselves. Right. And
Mm.
so if you grow up in society and you've never taken time to train your mind and your emotions and get control of the inner landscape and train your body to be healthy and fit and strong, then you are at the whim of a culture that is very intent on training you, right? Through social media, through news, through everything to be, to be a good consumer, to be, in our day and age of maybe a woke teenager or whatever the cultural kind of quote unquote air quote norms are, someone's training you, you know?
I think that's spot on because the way I kind of look at it is our kind of alarm in our head is can be adjusted.
That's right.
So if you walk around and the information you consume, the people you surround tell you that the world is, threatening or dangerous to push through or whatever have you, like your alarm's going to be on the lookout. Like, oh, where
Right.
am I going to be offended or what is going to send me over the edge? So, of course, your brain goes off at the simplest of things,
Right.
right? That alarm sounds. The way I kind of look at it is, in exercise, if you've been injured for a while and you go out for a jog or you go lift some weights, like if you haven't exercised in a while, that pain alarm sounds very early
Mm-hmm.
because you're
Right.
not used to it. So it's
Right.
very sensitive, even though hey, I've been here before. I can go much further or longer or harder in this workout. But because you've kind of been away from it for a while, that sensitivity goes up.
Right.
So we need to, in our own lives, is like make sure that our lives, our foundation of what we're doing from a physical, a health standpoint, from an information consumption standpoint, is like giving us our brain kind of feedback on reality so that our alarm isn't, super sensitive and gonna go off at any sign of danger, but is calibrated so it's like, yeah, it goes off when we're actually in trouble or when we actually need to pay attention to the pain, discomfort, or anxiety that's going on.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And the subtitle of your book is Why We Get Resilience Wrong and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. So what do we get wrong about resilience and what is the surprising science of real toughness? Cuz I'm
Yeah.
curious about that myself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we get wrong, and we've kind of been hinting around this, but I think what it is a couple things. Is A, we tend to think that toughness is only about, gritting your teeth, putting your
Right.
head down and pushing through.
Right. Got
And
it.
often it's like we talked about, it's about being able to relax or
Right.
sometimes let go or bring in some of that training for maybe from mindfulness or
Mhm.
meditation,
Mhm.
where it's like, how do we learn to not fight through this moment,
Mhm.
but accept it?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in the popular culture, it's almost like we give people a hammer and say, hey, this is going to solve every difficult challenge that you can face,
Right.
and instead, what we need to do is equip them with a multitude of tools to say, hey, you're going to face a lot of challenges in life. And sometimes you're going to have to pull out the wrench. Sometimes you're going to have to pull out the saw.
Mhm.
And that might be pushing through. That might be letting go. That might mean using mindfulness or
Mhm.
visualization or
Mhm.
whatever have you. But we need to equip people with those tools so that they can do the thing.
Yeah, I love that. I think we're in the West, we have such a bias toward action. Do this, do that, fix this, fix that. For the hammer, like you said, usually being your dominant tool. And when you combine that with a equal bias toward non-action, which is where mindfulness comes in, and time in nature and downtime, so you don't get burned out. Not just keep thinking you have to train harder, 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 longer, longer, but maybe that's not it, right? And they found that in exercise, my seal fit workouts, back in the day, we'd go 2-3 hours at a time, and then I was finding like, wait, I'm not sleeping well at night. Makes sense, right? My cortisol was all jacked up, and say, okay, so I broke those apart and I streamed them down, and there was a time to do that, but not all the time. So that's when I built in yoga and active recovery days and full on, do nothing days, and everything really balanced out because I was able to balance the yin and the yang, the action with the inaction.
I love that because what it gets at, and this is kind of what I tried to bring in this book, is it's about that nuance,
Yeah.
finding that kind of middle path where absolutely it is about like putting yourself in challenging
Hmm.
situations. But as you said there, in order to be able to put yourself in that situation, you have to be in a place where you're balanced, where you can perform, which often
Right.
means you have to be recovered, or you have to have the sleep necessary, or you have to have the life and the environment that supports you to, take on challenges. And
Right.
I think, this is no more evident. This is evident in our modern workplace often, as I get people who I talk to are like, I'm just like, I'm trying to take on more in my work, and I'm trying to, like, move up the ladder, but I just feel exhausted and I can't do it. And you talk to them a little bit about their situation, and they're like, they're micromanaged to death.
Right.
They have no like pathway forward in
Right.
their company. And you're like, of course you feel unmotivated and apathetic
Hmm.
because you're not satisfying kind of your basic psychological needs
Hmm.
that fulfill that motivation. And if you
Hmm.
can do that, then you're going to be able to perform out of a place of, being able to take risks and play to win instead of just kind of playing not to lose.
Yeah. Do you address the fact that, hard has many faces to it? So let me give you an example for our SEAL Fit training. You know, our version of hard things is 50 hours of nonstop physical, mental, and emotional team training. We call it Kokoro Camp. And at the end of Kokoro Camp, we recommend everyone, okay, great job. Those of you who completed, which is usually about 30 or 40%, now don't do anything for a month. And honestly, that's harder than Kokoro Camp for many of them because they're like, wait, I'm addicted to training. How am I supposed to not do anything? It was like, well, stretch a little bit, drink a lot of water, but don't do anything hard for 30 days. Because guess what? You just put an enormous load on your body. Think about 50 hours of training, right? You need 50 more hours of days of recovery, probably, or, not quite that. But what do you think about that?
There's one story in the book that really resonates with that idea, is that I talked to these world-class climbers who would climb, like Mount Everest and what
Hmm.
have you. And they kind of reframed this idea of like toughness, which often I think of as, or we often think of as like, oh, just persist, keep
Right.
doing challenging things. And one of them put it like this. It was like, Steve, the tough decision is when I'm going up that mountain, we're like a couple hundred meters away from the peak. I see it, but I have to stop and be very self aware and decide, do I have the energy to not only make it up to the top of the peak, but also all the way back down?
That's right. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and that's where I think, often we think it's like persist, make it to the peak. Well, that is often the kind of the easy decision when you're getting closer because your motivation is all towards that kind of reaching that goal. But
Hmm.
the tough decision is self-awareness to say, okay, what's best for me, my goals, my life, my purpose, my meaning aligned. And a lot of them will tell you it's like to stay alive, to see my family. Like
Hmm.
the goal of the peak doesn't overwhelm that. And I think that resonates with the point you made, which is, something that I saw working with elite marathoners, for example, or among the best in the world, is they would tell me, or I quickly found out my job as a coach wasn't necessarily to push them forward. They know how to do that. They know that is the skill they'd been developing for life.
Hmm.
But my job was to, in those moments, like you just mentioned about, to hold them back from doing something dumb after they'd done something like
Hmm.
incredibly hard, like, run the marathon. Is to say, hey, you gotta take some time off to let your body to recover and your mind to recover
Hmm.
because you just put it all out there. And
Hmm.
for people maybe like yourself and I who maybe think of ourselves maybe as pushers and like high performers and always striving, it's often that stepping back and not doing the thing
Hmm.
that is the toughest challenge.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting. This is I had a podcast yesterday with a world record holding mountaineer, Colin O'Brady, and he said that it was vipassana. One of the hardest things he'd done was taking 10 days of doing nothing but sitting in silence, and he credits that with saving his life on K2.
Mm.
Right, because he had done exactly what you were just talking about, what these other climbers talked about. He had made it all the way up to the final summit push, and then and some other teams were up there as well, and one of them, one team had forgotten a tent, and so they all, of course, you help your teammates out. They weren't his teammates, but you help your fellow mountaineers out, and so they all crammed into his tent, and they're talking about when he is going to go up, and he was like, he was starting to get just this odd feeling, right? And he closed his eyes and started meditating, and he got this intuitive hit. He said, "Don't go," and so he said, "I'm not going." And then they were all stunned because they just assumed, and he didn't go, and five climbers went up and didn't come back.
Mm.
And so the point here is that had he all been just do more, climb, and not also simultaneously developed that yin practice of the inner awareness and inquiry and listening, he could have easily been one of those five, or it would have been six climbers that didn't come back.
Wow,
And very powerful story.
that's a powerful story, and it resonates because actually one of my chapters in the book, I kind of outline, I call it "Listen to Your Body," which is that exact skill. Is you
Hmm.
see the best athletes, the best performers, what they're really good at
Hmm.
is going inside in those difficult moments and being like, okay,
Hmm.
like where's the truth? And like what my body is telling me. Should I keep going to the summit, or should I turn around and come back? And it's often difficult, but the more time you kind of spend developing that muscle, which can be done through vipassana or mindfulness or other skills, which I think, talking about societally, we often neglect because we never spend any time alone in our head often,
Hmm.
because we always have distractions or other things that can kind of occupy that space or boredom.
Hmm.
So that skill is for a lot of people never trained. So
Hmm.
one of the things
Right.
to me on okay, how do you want to be tough, is one of those foundational skills is, well, you got to spend a lot of time in your head alone,
That's right.
right? And if you do that, it gets a little more comfortable. You're able to kind of see the nuance of how thoughts float into your mind, and what, feelings and emotions arise, and whether you should shine the spotlight of attention on them or just kind of let them float on by.
Hmm.
But the only way we develop that muscle is spend time, being there,
Right.
which again, modern society kind of pushes us against.
Yeah, it is a skill, right? It's not like doing nothing. It's a skill. What's your or I should ask it this way: do you have a like works every time tool for getting someone out of a rut or helping someone get out of a rut?
Yeah, that's tough. I don't have a work every time, but what I like to call it is like, you've got to find some way to dislodge you from that pattern.
Hmm.
So the simple model I kind of use is, again, when you're in a rut, one of two things happens. Either your world becomes so narrow that it seems like, this stress or difficult moment or whatever you're struggling with is the be all end all. It's life or death.
Hmm.
Or you're zoomed all the way out and your brain has kind of checked out,
Hmm.
where it says, you know what, this is too threatening, dangerous, difficult, my ego's under attack, like I'm just going to check out and zone way out.
Hmm.
And generally what you see is, to get out of that space, you got to dislodge your brain by taking it in the opposite direction.
Hmm.
So if you're narrowed in, you've got to do some things that create perspective,
Hmm.
right?
I agree.
Maybe being out in nature, right, where it zooms you out, you know um spending time with friends who give you that perspective on what the challenge, what it's actually like to go through a challenge, and to reframe it. If you're kind of off in zoomed out world and kind of dissociating, you've got to zoom in, which means focus on that next step. Like, what is the simplest thing that you can control in this moment
Hmm.
to get to that next spot, and don't worry about what's coming, down the finish line. And often you see this happen in runners. I'll use the marathon example, is people freak out early in the marathon because they sit there like, I have 26 miles to go. I'm only on mile 3. It's kind
Hmm.
of painful already. And their minds just kind of check out and zoom way out and freak out and spiral because
Hmm.
they can't conceptualize, how am I going to get through this entire run or race? So you have to literally narrow in and be like, forget that, you know, 10 good steps, or make it to the next turn, or I'll check in at the next mile marker. And you've got to really kind of refocus and get your
Hmm.
brain out of that kind of lost in broad view.
I love that. I often when I trained SEALs or trained SEALs, I use the metaphor of a sniper team, right? The sniper team has the spotter who's doing that really, really narrow focused work, just keeping his eye on the target. Not the, I mean, the sniper, the shooter, and then the spotter is taking that broad perspective, scanning, seeing if threats are coming in, checking the weather and the wind direction, all that. And then I bring it and I said, okay, so one of them is trained through concentration training, the other is trained through mindfulness. Concentration takes you narrow attention control, focus, laser focused, and the other through broad perspective and being aware of your thoughts and emotions as well of situationally what's going on around you. And they said the holy grail is to train these so they come online simultaneously, and so it's akin to developing a whole mind approach where you don't have to toggle back between left brain and right brain thinking or between focus and expansion. You can have them both online simultaneously. I call that simultaneous mind.
Yeah, I love that concept, and I'm gonna add some research to that, which if you look at again, there's been some research on the best marathoners in the world,
Hmm.
okay? What they do when you compare their psychology versus novices
Hmm.
is they have that ability that you just talked about to
Mm,
go broad and narrow.
nice.
And you look at the novices or the, level down, what happens is they get pretty good at one of those things
Right.
and they don't have the ability to integrate or use both.
Right.
So what happens is they can succeed for a little bit because they, maybe have that narrow concentration, et cetera, until at some point it inevitably, fails them. And then they have no other skill, nowhere to go.
Right.
So I think that integration point is like backed up in the research on some of the
Right.
best athletes and the endurance athletes in the planet.
And it's interesting. I studied meditation now for many, many years, and concentration is one path, and mindfulness is another. And there are others. One TM calls their path automatic transcendence, and there's some like non-dual, touching the void, Taoist type paths. And usually people unknowingly stumble into one or the other, and then they find that it's hard, right? It's hard because there's there's prerequisites, right? And there's antecedents to both paths or the two primary paths, concentration and mindfulness. If you go jump right into mindfulness and your mind isn't able to concentrate, then you're basically just sitting down and thinking. You're still merged with your thoughts, right? And if you go into concentration and you never leave concentration behind, then you don't develop the metacognitive ability to have that broad-based situational awareness. So it's not an either or; it's a both and. And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to do is demystify meditation to bring it into the context of mental development, mental and emotional development, and parse out, what's a path to develop that whole mind, simultaneous mind, and then go beyond even into the spiritual realms.
I love that about your work, and I think that's one of the important things you're doing because often what happens is people hear mindfulness meditation and they have preconceptions that
Right.
often makes it where they resist that, but it
That's right.
really is that mental performance. And maybe
Right.
to add a layer on this is there's some wonderful work in the field of sports psychology that kind of approaches that same concept you're talking about
Hmm.
with that concentration versus mindfulness, and they tie it to performance,
Hmm.
where they say you know, there's all these performance states, but if you look at the two main ones is there's this feeling and experience of flow,
Hmm.
which is often tied to this kind of mindfulness,
Hmm.
experience. And
Hmm.
then they've classified another, which is called a clutch state, which
Hmm.
is often tied a little bit more to this narrow
Hmm.
experience.
Awesome. Right.
And similar to what you said there is it's not this either or, it's about having those both of those abilities
Right.
so that when whatever prerequisites come in and put you in that space where you could go one of either routes or go in the middle and use a little bit of both, you're equipped to have the tools to do so
Hmm.
instead of just relying like, well, I'm only performing when I can enter flow, or I'm only gonna come through when I feel like that clutch state where my adrenaline's high and I can just like focus on this one task. It really is that both and.
That is awesome. Awesome stuff, Steve. I'm totally in alignment, and it's been a wonderful conversation. So I really appreciate your work and your insight on this stuff. So your book, "Do Hard Things: Why We Get Resilience Wrong and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness," out in the marketplace. Where do we find it?
Yeah,
and where can people reach you?
you can get it anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes& and Nobles, all that
Yep.
stuff. You can see my work at stevemagness.com
Mhm.
or on all social media at Steve Magness, and I really appreciate your work and this conversation, Mark. It was a blast and a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks very much, and let us know if we can help you out with anything. Hoo-yah.